Hi, good evening. Kelly Lewis coming to you live on Sunday, January 3rd, 2021. Yahoo! It's 2021. We made it. It's the new year. Happy New Year to all of you. I'm still trying to get the positioning right. Is that better? Maybe not. We've got a little bit of festive behind me, and I have a corpse reviver here. Cheers. So I hope you have a fun beverage, alcoholic or non-alcoholic, if you're going to go clean for a clean, fresh start to the new year. Good for you. That's a reach. Okay, so this evening I am reading Chapter 12, Submarines Prowl Offshore, in the Just Rye Harbor history. The Trenholms, longtime residents of Ragged Neck, say that there were many submarines lurking off Portsmouth and Rye shores during World War II before the blackouts, but their presence was kept out of the news. This is understandable, as Portsmouth Naval Shipyard was just a few miles north and had become the largest American submarine base on the Atlantic coast. In 1943, the yard set a record by having 4 launchings in a single day. Fortunately, the German U-boats were more interested in coastal shipping from New York City southward. In that region, there was a tremendous impact. Quoting a training manual prepared at the Quonset Point, Rhode Island Naval Air Station, American historian Samuel Eliot Morison states, "The massacre enjoyed by the U-boats along our Atlantic coast in 1942 was as much a national disaster as if saboteurs had destroyed half a dozen of our biggest war plants." The manual emphasized that if a submarine sunk 2 6,000-ton ships and 1 3,000-ton tanker, the enemy would have to make 3,000 successful bombing sorties to knock out the same amount of equipment by air bombing. Here is a German submarine surrendering at Portsmouth. Great photo there. Is it clear? There we go. Robert Whitaker, in his book Land of Lost Content, wrote that the Army and Navy established camps at the Isles of Shoals on Appledore and Star Islands to keep watch for German submarines near the entrance to Portsmouth Harbor. Navy specialists in sonar set up a network of surveillance cables throughout the waters around the Isles of Shoals. If something triggered a warning, a telegraph alert was immediately sent to the Harbor Defense Command Center in Fort Stark at Jaffrey Point, Newcastle. Word was then sent to Camp Langdon, farther into the harbor on Great Island, where men would activate a large winch on a ledge near the beach. A net would then be drawn across the entire shipping channel between Wood Island on the east and Camp Langdon to the west. During most of the time when there was no alert, the cable net between Camp Langdon and Wood Island was kept partially pulled back to allow normal shipping to pass. Whitaker writes, "On dark, quiet nights, local residents who walked down to the beaches as part of a foot patrol guarding against German landing teams could actually hear the rumbling exhausts of the U-boats, which were recharging batteries within a mile or two offshore. Evidence remains today revealing just how close the Germans had been to this coast. A U-boat reportedly sits at the bottom of the ocean and serves as a sailor's tomb 1 mile off Hampton Beach, New Hampshire. 2 others were sunk a few miles east of Duck Island, Isles of Shoals." Reports Tom Clarie, "I always remember a secret story my dad told me as a boy. All New England and the eastern seaboard were in an uproar over fear of lurking Nazi submarines. T. Emmett Clarie, then House Minority Leader in the state of Connecticut, went to a meeting of New England state officials and legislatures, perhaps in Atlantic City, New Jersey. My dad sat down in a meeting room early and waited for people to come in. He noticed one by one that only governors and their aides were entering the room. He realized he had picked the wrong room." Clarie continues, "Top secret discussions started on the serious German submarine coastal threat. My father panicked even more when a guest book was passed around the room for signing. Because those in the room knew he was not the governor of Connecticut, he signed the ledger, 'Representative of the state of Connecticut.' He soon excused himself for a drink of water, ran out, and never returned. He always told that story to the family with much excitement and delight. My father was also a leading Connecticut state official coordinating World War II rationing, and I wish I had asked my father more about the rationing effort in that state when he was alive." In 1942, the coastal highway from Odeon Park north was closed to the public, who then had to use another route to travel along the coast between Portsmouth and Hampton. Sandra Goss Munsey, who grew up next to Rye Harbor at the Goss Farm, 251 Harbor Road, writes that she remembers as a child coming by car to the barrier on Route 1A at Odeon Park and having to turn around. Sandra's grandfather, Joseph Drake, has Mary Odiorn as one of his grandmothers in the family tree. Munsey recalls the World War II days when she was a young child in an essay compiled in 2004. World War II was the war when the submarine and the airplane came of age. Everyone knew the subs were out there. Up and down the Atlantic coast, civilian Ground Observer Corps posts operated under the direction of the Army Air Corps. Rye had two posts that I recall. One was north of Wallace Sands, another was built in the middle of the common on what was then called Straw's Point, now reverted to its earlier name of Lock's Neck, just south of Rye Harbor. Munsey continues, GOC, the Ground Observer Corps members were all volunteers, mostly local women during the day who worked in pairs scanning the sea and sky with binoculars. Their training involved memorizing the silhouetted shapes of airplanes and ships using flashcards and a little larger than playing cards. Other cards provided an estimate of distance. An observer reported every passing aircraft and vessel, regardless of size, shape, or description, by telephone to a regional center where the movement of any particular craft could be tracked on a map. The November 3rd, 1942 Portsmouth Herald reports, Straw's Point observers get armbands. These U.S. Army Air Force armbands were for observers at the Straw's Point station of the Aircraft Warning Service and featured gold wings and a white plaque on a blue background with the letters AWS in the middle. To receive an armband, an observer had to be in good standing with his post authorities and must have served at least 25 hours on duty. On January 29, 1943, the Herald announced that Major H.M. Baldrige, executive head of the Air Corps Ground Observer section of the Army's 1st Fighter Command in Boston, would address all persons engaged in volunteer spotting duty. Also addressing the spotters was Mrs. Robert Morris of Dover, New Hampshire, head of the Women's Division of the Ground Observer Crews. Officials okayed use of private cars and gas for those attending the meeting. A July 21st, 1943 Herald article titled Local Area Spotters to Hear Hub Experts Tell of New Plan quoted Reginald P. Kennard, Assistant Chief Observer at the Straw's Point Observation Post, as stating that although the post had 81 observers, there was still a vital need for more. This story reported that the observation tower at Straw's Point was now completed and in operation. Dr. Philip H. White was Chief Observer at Straw's Point, and Mrs. Phyllis H. White had become an instructor in plane identification after attending a 6-week course at an aircraft recognition school sponsored by the 1st Fighter Command in Boston. Munsey writes that often 2 family members would share an observation shift, which was the case in my family. My maternal grandmother, Anne C. Drake, and my father, Francis L. D. Goss, generally worked together. Frequently, I tagged along, voluntarily or otherwise, even practicing with the flashcards myself. Munsey's surveillance of the waters brought some success. One day, when my grandmother and I were standing watch, a submarine could be seen slowly rising from the water directly east of our post. By the time it had surfaced completely, it was evident from its silhouette that it was German. The phone call to the center confirmed that no U.S. submarines were known to be in the area. The Coast Guard patrol in the area also spotted the surfacing sub and panicked. Running down to the edge of the shore, he fired his rifle. Naturally, the sound carried quickly across the water. The sub immediately submerged. The skirmish was over. The probable reason for surfacing had been to dump garbage or recharge batteries. It wasn't the only sighting because other people along the New Hampshire coast reported observing the German sub, but it was our sighting, reports Munsey. Sandra Goss Munsey continues. The Coast Guard was also located in one of the homes at the entrance to the point from which fully armed young guardsmen patrolled all along the beaches 24 hours a day. As I recall, the building was small with a deck on the east side and windows all around. I can't remember if the deck was on all 4 sides, although it may have been. There was a table and a phone, perhaps a chair or 2. Reaching the deck was by a flight of stairs, since the building was raised above the ground for better sight distance. A single armed man would proceed from the house, which served as their base, walk north along the stones to what used to be known as Little Neck, around the harbor to Ragged Neck, and continue along Foss Beach until he met another Coast Guardsman at a rendezvous point further up. Meeting accomplished, the lone patrol would return to repeat his journey or be replaced by another. It must have been lonely and boring, not to mention uncomfortable during inclement weather. Her memories as a young girl continue. At night, if light escaped from a building, the Coast Guard patrol would knock on the door and require correction of the breach. I remember an occasional knock at our house, especially in the winter when supper preparations might result in a window shade by the sink being knocked askew. It was a bit disconcerting to open the door to an armed man in a uniform, although I don't remember ever being frightened when it happened. All this care concerning window shades was not unfounded. Samuel Eliot Morison writes, one of the most reprehensible failures on our part was the neglect of local communities to dim their waterfront lights, or of military authorities to require them to do so until 3 months after the submarine offense started. When this obvious defense measure was first proposed, squawks went up all the way from Atlantic City to southern Florida that the tourist season would be ruined. Morison continues, Miami and its luxurious suburbs threw up 6 miles of neon light glow, against which the southbound shipping that hugged the reefs to avoid the Gulf Stream was silhouetted. Ships were sunk and seamen drowned in order that the citizenry might enjoy business as usual. Finally, on 18th of April 1942, the Eastern Sea Frontier ordered waterfront lights and sky signs doused, and the Eastern Defense Command of the Army ordered a stringent dim out on 18th of May. Sandra Goss Munsey writes, everyone was required to equip their houses with blackout curtains or shades. People who lived along the shore had to be particularly cautious about displaying lights at night. Even fairly small lights in Rye are easily seen from the Isles of Shoals and vice versa. A small light on the shore could serve to guide a spy to a landing or a plane to a target, so blackout curtains became an addition to every home. Munsey goes into great detail in describing these curtains and shades, thus underlining the concept of blackout was a life or death matter to residents around Rye Harbor for protection against hostile submarines. A regular roll-up window shade installed inside the frame would be covered by a second, heavier weight, black or dark green roll-up shade. Installation of the second shade, placed on the outside of the frame, was intended to roll flat and tight against it. The shade material itself was stiffened cloth. The wooden rollers were intended to be permanent, not the cardboard throwaways of the 21st century. The installing or replacing of a shade involved carefully removing the tacks holding the old fabric to the rod, cutting the new shade fabric to the proper size. The bottom hem to hold the slat was stitched by the manufacturer. Tacking the top evenly onto the rod, putting the old slat into the hem, and hanging the whole thing back on the window frame. Hopefully it would be long enough, wide enough, and even. It was not one of my father's favorite chores. If you didn't have an old rod of sufficient length, rods were available separately, or one was fashioned with new hardware and a dowel. Of course, with changes in humidity, the sides of the shades might curl, leaving gaps for light to sneak through. For little problems, stick-on tape might work. If the problem became too great, the shade could be taken down, removed from the rod, and reversed to place the curl against the window. Stick-on tape made in black or dark green to match could be used to repair the inevitable tears that occurred in frequent use, since wartime shortages made replacement difficult. Munsey states, heavy window draperies were not a common window decor in the 1940s, particularly in farmhouses and the cottages along the beach. Draperies could provide additional protection to avoid light emission. However, most women favored popular ruffled sheers and lace or other simple cotton curtains, increasing the importance for proper fit of light-blocking blackout shades. Some people discovered that lamps had to be relocated or heavier lampshades used to direct the light away from the windows. Along with all the precautions taken to prevent light from escaping from houses, any other light used out of doors required shading. Black electrical tape applied to the upper half of motor vehicle headlight glass lowered the spread of the beam of light. Tapered headlights reduced the visibility distance considerably for drivers. However, the small amount of traffic didn't create a problem, reduced as it was by gasoline rationing, low ownership rates, rarely more than one vehicle per family, although we owned a car, a truck, and a tractor because of the farm, and a society that simply didn't travel a great deal. Sandra Goss Munsey notes that flashlights were similarly taped or covered by the hand to allow just enough light to see the next step on a pathway. One of my chores at night was helping my father, Robert B. Goss, with the cows and other livestock kept on the farm. I had my own flashlight, a red metal rectangular lantern with a pair of folding handles on the back, and a stable base so that it could be set down without rolling away, and my hands were small, so I taped it too. So that it could be set down without rolling away. I couldn't cover the lens since it was about 2.5 inches in diameter and my hands were small, so I taped it too. Then there was the drive during the period to find a substitute for the fiber, kapok, a growth of silky fibers that clothed seeds inside the pods of the massive tropical ceiba tree. Kapok was used primarily as filling for mattresses, life preservers, sleeping bags, and also as insulation. The primary source for kapok was in Indonesia and surrounding Southeast Asian countries controlled by the Japanese. Tom Clarie saw one of these massively spreading trees 40 years ago at a former restaurant in Central Florida called the kapok tree. And kapok is incidentally spelled K-A-P-O-K. Sandra Goss Munsey recalls that the U.S. government launched a drive to have school children collect ripe milkweed pods for life jackets and other uses. Like the others, I collected bags of pods from around the farm and from the land behind my grandfather Joseph H. Drake's Washington Road home, number 711. We returned the bags to school for collection. I always wondered if the milkweed seed was ever actually used or if it had merely been a propaganda move for the war effort. Sandra Munsey's sister, Connie Goss Carrington, told Rosemary Clarie that her grandmother Anne Drake and everyone else kept saying and thinking, "Watch out for the Frogmen! They could come ashore off a German submarine and sabotage sensitive sites." Munsey writes that rumors of the time mentioned Kittery Point as a frequently used spot for spies being put ashore by the German submarines. She also notes the regulations requiring people to carry identification. I don't know whether every adult in the country was required to have personal identification cards or not. People living along the coast did. That presented a major problem for Sandra Munsey's grandmother, Goss, Marion C. Bennett Goss, who was born in Nova Scotia in 1872 and did not have a birth certificate. Ministers in Nova Scotia were sent to Canada from Scotland and took their church records back to Scotland at the end of their terms, leaving nothing behind. Relatives of Marion were eventually able to prove her birth, and she finally got her identification card. Sandra writes, "As a little kid, probably not more than 4 or 5 at the time, it made no sense to me. After all, there she was, standing right there in the kitchen. Of course she had been born. It must have been a huge topic of discussion at the time to impress it on my memory at that age." Says Munsey, children were not issued identification cards. However, I clearly remember Police Chief Manning Remick and a state trooper coming to the Rye School and fingerprinting everyone in the first grade class in 1943. I can remember being told that it was being done so that we could be identified if we became separated from our parents, the way many English children had been. We had heard the stories of how English children had been moved inland and away from the cities for safety. No one made a big deal about it, so we were not frightened by the prospect. Of course, what was never discussed was the possibility of direct attack. It was only much later that I realized that the fingerprints could be used to identify the dead and injured. Sandra Munsey goes on to explain how pervasive World War II's impact was on daily life. The U.S. government issued saving stamps and the books in which to paste them. Each week for 10 cents or for 25 cents, a saving stamp could be purchased to stick in the book. After the book was filled, it was exchanged for $25 war bonds. The 10-cent stamps were red and the 25-cent ones were green. The teachers kept track of stamp sales along with the milk money and the milkweed collection. Munsey relates that war bond drives were a regular part of the civilian war effort. Probably the biggest locally was one held in Portsmouth on Market Street. Grandmother Drake took me to see it. A stage was built at the east end of the square. We stood near the corner next to North Church. The usual endless parade of speakers participated. The only important thing that happened, as far as I was concerned, was the visit by movie star Dorothy Lamour. Having seen some of the famous road movies in which she, Bing Crosby, and Bob Hope starred, this was a big moment for me. Munsey writes with pride that Grandmother Drake worked for the Red Cross in World War I, knitting and making bandages. It was natural that she once again participated in Red Cross activities in World War II. She volunteered at the Red Cross headquarters in Portsmouth. One of her duties involved transmitting emergency messages to and from servicemen and their families. Sometimes it meant arranging transportation for Navy personnel at Portsmouth Navy Yard to return home in a family crisis. Other times, layettes were assembled for young service wives with newborns living far from family and friends and their sailor husbands out at sea. Sandra Goss Munsey continues, Red Cross Motor Corps was a department of the Red Cross consisting mostly of women with driver's licenses and access to automobiles. Not every woman could drive at the beginning of the war. Uniformed volunteers, they marched proudly in local parades. Their purpose was to be the wheels of the Red Cross in making pickups of deliveries and packages and driving military dependents to appointments, for example. Extra gasoline stamps may have been granted to the motor corps drivers when they used their own vehicles. Munsey remembers her trips to the Red Cross office with her grandmother. I learned to fold and roll bandages, tie on a splint, and make an arm sling, practicing at home with my dolls or on myself. I was given my own Red Cross first aid book, but I was too young to attend the classes. When I saw Grandmother Drake in a Portsmouth parade, I felt that she must be doing a very important job to be included in the march. Munsey relates, Nazi Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, beginning the parade of German submarines towed into Portsmouth Harbor. Our submarine was one of those brought into Portsmouth Navy Yard. The commanding officer bragged that he had breached the Portsmouth Harbor submarine net on several occasions without detection. The surrendered submarines were later refitted and used by the United States. She writes, eventually, families of Navy Yard workers were given the opportunity to tour the submarines captured and brought to Portsmouth, which I remember quite clearly, being impressed with its smallness and tight quarters. There was high excitement in those days since German U-boats were considered the most sophisticated underwater technology on Earth. Here's another picture of German officers aboard their captured submarine. Well, now I have come to the end of the chapter, but it is 5:19, so let's take a look at the next chapter. Okay, chapter 13, Shipwrecks and Rescues, is only 4 pages, so I can get through that and then close. Chapter 13, Shipwrecks and Rescues. Emma Kimball, in her handwritten notes for her unpublished work in the early days of Rye, wrote that on December 19th, 1850, in a terrible snowstorm, the topsail schooner Rachel and Nancy, coming from Bristol, England to Boston with a cargo of lumber, was wrecked shortly after 9 in the morning on Great Rock at the southern point of the harbor. She was driven against the rock with sufficient force to move it considerably, and afterwards wore a deep place in it as she was forced against it by the incoming tides. There were but a few hands aboard, and as the vessel struck amid the awful breakers, they were wild with fright and attempted to jump overboard, hoping to swim ashore. Kimball continues, the people assembled upon the shore and endeavored to rescue them. A new float was taken out, but before it reached the water, the wind took it from the men, and whirling it over and over, left it in a field nearly a third of a mile away. No sound could reach the poor sailors, but motions were made that they should remain on board the schooner. But in spite of their warnings, seaman John Thurston jumped overboard and drowned. Then the tide went out. The vessel was left high and dry, and the others of the crew were safely taken from the wreck. On April 8, 1851, during a great gale, the schooner Boutwell, out of Orrington, Maine, came ashore at Ragged Neck at about 10 in the evening. Though the ship lost its deck cargo and had damage below the waterline, it was later towed into Rye Harbor and repaired. The Portsmouth Herald featured this headline in its March 6, 1902 edition. Shipwrecked crews, 2 vessels lost in last night's storm. The Nellie Bly on the rocks at Rye Harbor. A vicious northeast storm struck early in the afternoon of March 5th, catching a fleet of about 10 fishing vessels on the fishing grounds of Boone Island. Before they could make it to safety, the blinding snow had shut out all sight of land. By dark, all but 4 of the fleet had managed to find their way in by whaleback light to safe anchorage in the inner harbor, but the Boston-owned fishing schooner Nellie Bly was driven on the rocks at Ragged Neck at Rye Harbor shortly after 6 that same evening. The Nellie Bly was commanded by Captain James McKinnon. The vessel weighed almost 60 tons and had a cargo of 5,000 pounds of cod aboard. According to the report in the Herald, a blinding snowstorm prevailed at the time, and the crew was unable to establish their whereabouts until breakers loomed up a few hundred feet ahead. Then it was too late to escape the danger, and the little vessel struck the rocks, well inshore with a mighty crash. The crew managed to clear away a couple of dories, and into them the crew of 10 men scrambled, leaving everything but a few personal effects behind them. Then came a long, hard struggle to reach the shore. The sea was very rough and half submerged. Ledges were numerous. Finally, the beach was reached, and the men were taken to Wallace Sands life-saving station, where they were made comfortable by Captain Wells and his crew. Word came from Wallace Sands the next morning that at daybreak the Nellie Bly had vanished, and not a bit of wreckage could be found ashore. During the night, the schooner had been blown off into deep water and sank. According to the Portsmouth Herald of September 9, 1909, 2 local fishermen got into trouble and came close to drowning off Rye Harbor on a previous day. George Brewster Caswell and another man were on their way to fishing grounds off the Isles of Shoals when a heavy gale blew in. During the especially heavy squall, the masts were carried away, and they were suddenly in immediate danger of being swamped. Their distress signals were seen by the life-saving crew at Rye Harbor, and they started out in their surfboat. After a long row, they rescued the men. They had been driven several miles to sea when picked up, and in the rough sea and gale of wind were having a hard time of it. On Monday morning, August 21st, 1939, Anne Locke and her brother Richard, along with Richard Corso and George Upton, were walking along the shore just south of the harbor when suddenly 16-year-old Anne screamed. She saw 5 bodies at the water's edge. A 6th body was found soon after. The victims had left Dover Point the previous morning with skipper Ralph Pryor aboard his 25-foot cabin cruiser Nodska. Conflicting reports had the party going fishing or perhaps heading offshore to view the Squallus's salvage operations. Apparently there was a thick fog, and the captain attempted to reach safety at Rye Harbor. In the dark, the vessel capsized when it struck rocks near Straws Point. The victims were wearing life preservers and had been tied together, possibly Pryor's attempt to pull the people ashore, but died after being battered in the heavy surf. According to the Portsmouth Herald, salvage work on the Squalus had been interrupted on Sunday because of rough seas. Some residents of Straws Point reported hearing faint cries for help during Sunday night, but couldn't determine the source of the voices. Coincidentally, both the Rye Beach and Wallace Sands life-saving stations, which provided regular beach foot patrols, had recently closed, and local people had complained about inadequate protection for mariners. The 6 people who died were Prior and Clarence Yetton, both of Dover, Prior's niece Ethelyn Cutler and fiancé Walter Hargraves, and Joseph Wajner, who was married to another Prior niece, all of Newmarket, and Frank Plant of New Boston. On a happier note, the Nashville Telegraph of July 19, 1948 reported that 3 Manchester, New Hampshire boys were rescued from the ocean after their dory capsized 3/4 of a mile off Rye Harbor jetty. They were saved by Dr. Parkinson Oddie of Lawrence, Massachusetts in his cabin cruiser. A New York man was the sole survivor of a boating incident on July 25, 1963. 4 people left Rye Harbor in an 18-foot runabout named the Carol Lou to do fishing off the Isles of Shoals. The boat was powered by a 75-horsepower outboard motor. The fishing party was due to return to the harbor at 6 in the evening. When it became evident that something was wrong, a relative summoned the Coast Guard. A utility boat from the Hampton Beach Life-Saving Station searched all night and was returning to the station an hour after daybreak when it found a survivor 1 1/3 miles off Rye Harbor clinging to the overturned boat while holding a 71-year-old dead man. The survivor said he had died in my arms at about 5 o'clock. Rescuers said they had to pry his hands loose from the elderly man. He said he had also tried to hold on to a woman passenger, but she slipped away. Another passenger tried to swim to shore but didn't make it. The bodies were all recovered. The relative who had alerted the Coast Guard waited at the Rye Harbor dock and then sadly watched the bodies brought to shore. He mentioned that the group did not take along a portable radio the family owned because none of them had a license to operate it. He was the only licensed operator. He said his family had been coming to Rye to vacation for 14 years, but added, "I'll never come back." In mid-May 1976, 3 independent study students at the University of Michigan left Bar Harbor, Maine, in a quarter-scale replica of a Viking ship they had built. Their plans were to trace the route of the Norsemen as they explored the eastern coastline of America in the year 1000 AD. On June 7, 1976, as Seacoast residents watched the 18-foot vessel travel south along the coast of New Hampshire, the Viking boat hit some heavy seas and capsized off Lock's Neck. "Our lives were in danger," said one of the students, but thanks to Senator McLaughlin, his son Michael, and Arthur Splain, the students were rescued. On June 24, 1976, a letter of appreciation was sent to the editor of the Portsmouth Herald discussing the incident. The men thanked their rescuers and also the Manning Remick family who took them in, gave our dragon boat a dry dock, and helped rebuild the vessel. In early July, the trio again set sail on their Viking ship, with New York as their destination. So next Sunday will be Chapter 14, Hurricanes and Other Storms. Until then, have a great week. Take care.